I think you know exactly where you stand in this company. This meeting is for board members only.
Imagine standing in a room full of people, your hard work and vision on the line, when someone dismisses you in front of the world, not for your mistakes, but for who you are. That exact moment unfolded during a multi-billion-dollar deal, where one arrogant act of disrespect triggered an event that would shake the financial world overnight. This is a story about patience, strategy, and the quiet, devastating power of justice. Before we begin, please take a moment to leave a comment telling us what everyday sound always gives you a fright and subscribe to the Voices of Our Mothers channel. We're building a community focused on finding strength when you least expect it. Now, back to the chilling truth lurking next door. Now let's get back to the story. The morning air was quiet, almost deceptively so, as Ava arrived at the sleek, glass-fronted building where the day's meeting would change everything. There was a certain hush in the city streets, the kind that felt like the world was holding its breath without even knowing it. Inside, the office was alive with movement, executives in crisp suits, assistants shuffling papers, and the faint hum of conversations that barely rose above a whisper. Everything looked orderly, calm, professional, but Ava knew better than to trust appearances. She had learned over the years that moments like this were often a thin veil for tension, so thick you could cut it with a knife. Ava moved through the corridor with quiet confidence, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor. She didn't rush, but every step carried purpose. Years of preparation had brought her here, to the center of one of the largest merger negotiations the financial world had seen in decades. Two companies, a $2.4 billion deal, and millions of eyes silently watching. She knew that behind the glass walls and polished smiles, every gesture, every pause, every word would be dissected, analyzed, and remembered. And she also knew that in a room like this, respect was currency, more valuable than dollars, more enduring than contracts. She paused outside the conference room door and took a slow breath. This was it, the moment where patience and skill would collide with human ego, where careful strategy could either protect her or put everything at risk. She reminded herself of the principle that had guided her career. The work you do, the respect you give, and the dignity you maintain are the things no one can take from you unless you allow them to. Ava's hands were steady, her mind sharp, her focus absolute. She could feel the pulse of the office behind the door, a quiet vibration of expectation, but she let it wash over her without disturbing her calm. Inside, the room was arranged with precision. Investors sat along polished oak tables, papers neatly stacked, digital tablets glowing with market reports, and every chair occupied by someone who considered themselves an authority in their own right. At the head of the table sat the chairwoman, a figure larger than life in reputation, commanding presence that filled the room, and a reputation for exacting arrogance. Ava studied her quietly. The chairwoman's eyes flicked over everyone in the room, sharp, evaluating, a silent measure of who deserved attention and who didn't. Ava knew that much of the power in that room came from perception, from the way the chairwoman made people feel, either elevated or dismissed with a glance. Ava took her seat, setting down her portfolio, her notes, and her composure all in one deliberate motion. She felt the weight of history in her hands, years of building her company, every late night, every difficult decision, every risk that had been measured and calculated. She could feel the energy in the room shift slightly as the chairwoman's gaze met hers. It wasn't hostility, not yet, it was a test. And Ava had long ago learned to answer tests not with emotion, but with clarity. The room settled into a rhythm. Phones were silenced, cameras adjusted, and the opening remarks began. Investors leaned forward slightly, eager to catch every word, every nuance. Ava could hear the faint scrape of pens against paper, the subtle murmur of agreement or quiet dissent. The air was full of anticipation, the kind that makes your skin tingle in places you didn't even notice. And in the midst of it all, Ava remained calm. Not arrogant, not dismissive, just focused, present, aware of the stakes without letting them tighten her chest or cloud her judgment. It was in that calm, in that poised patience, that the first signs of trouble whispered across the room. A slight tilt of the chairwoman's head, a subtle curl of the lip, and the almost imperceptible narrowing of her eyes. Ava noticed these things because she had to. The tiniest shift in demeanor could signal the start of something far bigger than a boardroom disagreement. She reminded herself silently, everything you do now matters, not just for the money, but for the respect of everyone watching, for the legacy of every choice you've made. Minutes passed, each one stretching with quiet intensity until the first exchange began. Polished words floated across the table, measured, precise, designed to impress and reassure. But Ava could feel the tension beneath them, the unspoken judgments, the subtle undercurrents of ego and expectation. Every hand gesture, every glance, every pause carried meaning. She stayed present, reading the room like a story unfolding in slow motion, knowing that the moment that would define the day, the moment that could change everything, was coming. And it would be swift, shocking, and utterly public. And so, in the stillness before the storm, Ava breathed again, steady and deliberate, feeling the weight of the world balanced delicately on her awareness. She could not yet see the first crack, could not yet hear the whispers that would soon become headlines. But she could sense the pivot, the invisible line that would soon be crossed, the one that would transform this calm, precise room into a moment remembered in infamy. The room had settled into a delicate rhythm, the kind where everyone's focus is balanced between what is being said and what is being left unsaid. Ava's calm presence radiated across the polished table, a quiet confidence that seemed to anchor the space. And then, as the meeting was about to move into the formal handshakes and greetings, the subtle tension that had been humming under the surface shifted into something heavier, more tangible. It started with a slight movement, almost unnoticeable unless you were paying close attention. The chairwoman, seated at the head of the table, extended her hand with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. On the surface, it was the routine gesture of professional courtesy. But Ava, trained by years of experience and countless encounters with people who wore arrogance like armor, felt the undercurrent immediately. She rose and offered her hand, steady, open, polite. The room held its breath, not yet aware of the storm about to break. Then, in a moment so sharp it could have cut the air, the chairwoman's hand hovered briefly, then dropped back to her side, refusing the gesture entirely. "We don't shake hands with people like you," she said, her voice carrying a cold, deliberate clarity. It wasn't loud, but it was clear enough for cameras, investors, and colleagues to catch every syllable. A hush fell across the table, the kind of silence that makes your skin crawl and your heart instinctively tighten. Some of the younger executives fidgeted in their chairs, uncertain how to react. A few tried to glance away, hoping the moment would somehow pass unnoticed. But it didn't. The statement hung in the room, heavy and undeniable, and in that suspended second it became clear that this wasn't just arrogance. It was outright humiliation, calculated and public. Ava froze for a heartbeat, letting the words sink in. She felt the familiar flash of heat rise to her cheeks, not from embarrassment, but from recognition of the magnitude of the slight. Years of preparation, careful strategy, and personal investment in her company's success suddenly collided with a blatant act of disrespect. And yet, despite the shock, her body remained steady, her breath even. She had been in situations like this before, though never so overtly cruel, and she had learned the hard way that anger was a dangerous luxury in a room like this. Instead, she let her mind scan the room quietly. The investors were watching, some with surprise, some with discomfort, and others with the detached curiosity of professionals who had seen tension before. A few whispered quietly to one another, eyebrows raised, realizing that they were witnessing something rare. An executive being humiliated in real time by someone who had assumed absolute authority. Ava could feel their eyes, feel their thoughts buzzing like electricity in the space between them. She remembered, in that suspended moment, all the people who had ever underestimated her, all the times she had been dismissed, overlooked, or judged unfairly. And she allowed herself a brief, silent acknowledgement, not of revenge yet, but of awareness. She was present, fully aware of the power dynamics in play, the imbalance of perception, and the subtle ways this single act could ripple into consequences far beyond this room. The chairwoman, sensing her dominance was unchallenged in that instant, allowed a smug smile to curl across her face, as if the humiliation had been her intended accomplishment. But Ava's face remained calm, serene, and unreadable. She didn't return the smile, but she didn't flinch either. Her mind, moving faster than anyone in the room could perceive, began evaluating options, reviewing agreements, clauses, and the possible repercussions of every next step. She felt the familiar rhythm of calculation, the silent pulse of strategy that had become second nature over years of navigating high-stakes negotiations. And then there were the cameras. Ava knew the moment was being recorded. Live streams would capture this exchange, snippets would circulate in investor circles, headlines would eventually form around what had just transpired. The world would see this, and while many would focus on the insult itself, Ava already understood something the chairwoman did not. The act had inadvertently revealed weakness, overconfidence, and arrogance. She allowed a slow exhale, a gesture unnoticed by most, and simply lowered her hand. The movement was quiet, deliberate, controlled. It wasn't defeat. It wasn't surrender. It was a quiet acknowledgement that the story was far from over. That one moment of cruelty did not define the outcome. Ava's presence, her composure, and her intelligence were the real forces at play, and she would let them unfold on their own terms. Around the table, the energy had shifted. Investors glanced at one another, some uncertain, some intrigued, sensing that this day would not be ordinary. The chairwoman, unaware of the calculation taking place just feet away, continued as if nothing had happened. But Ava had already begun charting her path forward. This moment, shocking and public though it was not the climax, it was the beginning. And in her mind, every option, every clause, every potential move had already been catalogued, ready to be deployed with precision. And so, as the room tentatively resumed its formalities, the tension lingered, an invisible weight pressing lightly on the polished table. Ava's eyes did not waver. Her posture did not falter. She was fully aware that what had just happened would be remembered, dissected, and judged. But she also knew that in that calm awareness, in that quiet, measured observation, lay the true power, the seed of a response that would be felt far beyond these walls, far beyond the morning's meeting. Ava returned to her seat with a sense of quiet control, her hand resting lightly on the polished surface of the table. The words had landed, sharp and deliberate, but instead of reacting in anger, she allowed herself a few moments of stillness. She could feel the tension in the room like a living thing, pressing against every wall, flowing in the silent spaces between murmurs and exchanged glances. And yet, within that pressure, Ava found clarity. She had trained for moments like this, not for the ease of success, but for the exact kind of challenge that now faced her. Her mind drifted to the details she had studied for months, the contracts and clauses that formed the backbone of the merger. Among them, one stood out, Clause 8.3, a provision that had once seemed like a minor safety net, but now loomed in her thoughts like a beacon. It allowed her to withdraw investment in the case of documented misconduct or unethical behavior. At the time, it had felt like a standard precaution, something to protect her company against unforeseen missteps. But now, in this quiet, high-stakes moment, she realized it was far more than that. It was a tool, a carefully crafted safeguard, ready to be employed if necessary. Ava's gaze moved across the table again. The chairwoman, oblivious to the storm quietly building in Ava's mind, continued speaking, weaving through points of the negotiation as though the earlier slight had never happened. The arrogance was almost palpable, a shield the chairwoman had used throughout her career to intimidate, manipulate, and assert dominance. But Ava had seen through that facade long ago. She knew that beneath the bravado was a vulnerability, a susceptibility to miscalculation, to the consequences of underestimating the intelligence and preparation of others. Her thoughts were methodical, precise. She ran through the possibilities, the immediate reaction of investors, the legal ramifications, the ripple effect that would follow a withdrawal. Ava had always believed that strategy was most powerful when calm and invisible, when it was not obvious that a move was being made until it had already been executed. There was power in patience, in observation, in the silent accumulation of advantage. And that was exactly what she was doing now. The room itself seemed to shrink around her as she allowed herself to focus inward. She pictured every step, every consequence, the potential reactions of everyone in the room and beyond. She considered the investors first, their curiosity, their fear, their need for clarity. She thought of the media, the stories that would inevitably emerge, and how perception could amplify every misstep. Most of all, she thought of her own team, who had entrusted her with the responsibility to act with integrity and precision. She could not allow anger or haste to dictate her actions. She had to be calm, deliberate, surgical. For a moment, she closed her eyes, imagining the clauses of the contract as tools in her hands, each one carefully designed to uphold fairness, justice, and respect. She envisioned the simple yet profound principle that had guided her life and career. That respect is a currency far more valuable than money. And in that thought, she found both reassurance and resolve. The chairwoman's insult, cruel as it was, had done exactly what arrogance always does. It revealed weakness, it opened a door. Ava would not walk through it recklessly. She would move carefully, deliberately, and without emotion clouding her judgment. Opening her eyes, Ava allowed a subtle shift in her posture. She didn't make a show of it, didn't draw attention to herself. Her hands remained folded neatly, her expression serene, almost neutral. But inside, her mind was a flurry of calculation, weighing every factor with calm precision. She considered timing, the exact moment when executing Clause 8.3 would be most effective. She thought of the documentation required, the clarity needed to ensure that every action was legally and ethically sound. She envisioned the chain reaction that would follow, not in anger, not as revenge, but as a rightful response to arrogance and misconduct. The chairwoman continued speaking, oblivious, while Ava's internal strategy began to crystallize. She imagined the headlines, the stories that would be told, and how they would inevitably frame the situation. And Ava knew that if she moved carefully, she could control the narrative, or at least the outcome. She could ensure that justice, not vengeance, guided the moment. And the most powerful realization came quietly. She didn't need to prove anything to the chairwoman in that room. The proof would be in the execution of her plan, in the calm, measured application of the tools she had prepared, and in the clarity of her own conscience. Ava allowed herself a final, slow breath, feeling the weight of the decision settle comfortably within her. She knew that action would come soon, but not yet. The room around her still buzzed with polite conversation. Investors still leaned forward in attention, and the chairwoman still commanded the space with her presence. And yet, beneath the calm surface, a quiet storm was forming. Ava's strategy, invisible and deliberate, was now in motion, not in haste, but in the perfect alignment of patience, principle, and preparation. In that stillness, she understood something essential. Power was not in the loud response, the dramatic gesture, or the visible display. Power was in quiet readiness, in the unwavering commitment to act when the time was right, in the knowledge that respect and justice could never be hurried. And as the meeting moved toward the next agenda point, Ava's mind remained clear, focused, and resolute, ready to turn the moment of public humiliation into a lesson that no one in the room, or beyond, would ever forget. By the time the meeting adjourned, the office had returned to its usual rhythm, at least on the surface. Phones buzzed softly, chairs scraped across polished floors, and conversations resumed with the faint hum of professionalism. But beneath that veneer, a quiet storm was already gathering. Ava had left the room with the same calm composure she had carried throughout the encounter, but in her mind, a sequence of events had been set into motion that would ripple far beyond the walls of that conference room. Back in her office, she allowed herself a moment to close the door and exhale slowly. The air was heavy with anticipation, yet she felt none of the panic that might have gripped someone else. Ava had always believed that decisive action was born of clarity, not emotion. She reviewed the documents one last time, ensuring every I was dotted, every clause cited, and every condition met with absolute precision. Clause 8.3 had been activated, not impulsively, not as a reaction to hurt, but as a measured, legal, and ethical response to the chairwoman's misconduct. The first notice of withdrawal went out quietly, almost imperceptibly. A simple, professional email to the board, and the investors signaled the exercise of the clause, accompanied by the necessary documentation. There was no drama in her tone, no embellishment, just the facts presented with careful clarity. And yet, even as the words were sent, Ava could sense the magnitude of what was about to happen. In those few sentences lay $2.4 billion, poised to vanish from the merger, and with it, the confidence of everyone who had assumed the chairwoman's dominance would carry the day. The evening descended over the city like a blanket, indifferent to the chaos that would soon unfold. Ava, in the calm of her office, watched as messages began to circulate. Investors received the withdrawal notice and read it once, twice, 3 times, each ray read bringing a sharper awareness of the reality. By the time the news reached the major financial media outlets, the story had already begun to spread like wildfire. Headlines flashed across screens. $2.4 billion pulled overnight. Merger collapses following boardroom humiliation, and the handshake that shook Wall Street. Meanwhile, in the offices of the chairwoman, confusion and disbelief grew. Staff members whispered in hurried tones, papers were shuffled frantically, and phone calls rang unanswered as people tried to comprehend the sudden shift. The arrogance that had carried her so far now seemed fragile, brittle, and painfully exposed. She had misjudged the one person who could respond with both integrity and power, and the consequences were immediate, undeniable, and irreversible. Across the financial world, the impact was felt in real time. Stock prices began to wobble, the valuation of the company plummeting as confidence faltered. Investors who had trusted the deal began to reconsider their positions. Analysts scrambled to assess the situation, their reports punctuated with astonishment at how swiftly a single act of documented misconduct could unravel a multi-billion-dollar deal. Ava watched the numbers, not with glee, but with the steady awareness that justice was unfolding exactly as it should. It wasn't revenge, it was accountability, precise and unyielding. In the quiet of her office, Ava allowed herself a moment to reflect. She thought about the irony of the situation, that the chairwoman's public display of arrogance, intended to assert dominance and shame, had instead exposed a vulnerability no one had anticipated. A moment that had seemed small, almost inconsequential at the time, had triggered a cascade of consequences. Ava understood now, more deeply than ever, that respect and decency were currencies far more valuable than money, and the lack of them could topple even the mightiest of empires. Her team reached out, cautiously at first, checking in, confirming that everything was proceeding as planned. They shared updates of investor reactions, the slow trickle of media reports, and the subtle shifts in market sentiment. Ava listened carefully, absorbing each piece of information without allowing it to disturb her focus. This was not a moment for celebration, nor for panic. It was a moment to witness the outcome of measured, deliberate action. And then came the broader recognition. By early morning, the story had grown beyond the financial press. Social media snippets, opinion columns, and investor forums buzzed with the narrative that had begun in that small, polished conference room. The incident was quickly dubbed the Handshake Collapse, a name that captured both the cause and the consequence in a way that would linger in the public imagination. Headlines emphasized the audacity, the suddenness, the sheer impact of a single, calm executive acting decisively in the face of disrespect. Ava, watching it all unfold, remained serene. She understood that the power of this moment lay not in spectacle, but in the quiet, invisible strategy she had employed. There had been no shouting, no impulsive gestures, no attempt to humiliate, just clear observation, adherence to principle, and the careful execution of a plan that had been prepared for exactly this kind of challenge. The collapse had been swift, but it was surgical, and in its precision lay the lesson for all who had underestimated her. The world outside her office had shifted overnight, and the consequences would continue to unfold in ways no one could yet fully predict. Investors recalculated, media narratives formed, and reputations teetered precariously. But within Ava, there was a profound sense of calm. She had acted with integrity, with intelligence, and with patience. The chairwoman's arrogance had set the stage, and Ava's quiet strategy had delivered the outcome that respect and foresight always command. And yet, the story was far from over. This was only the point where the ripple began, spreading wider and deeper, carrying with it the lessons of the day and the anticipation of the next move. By the next morning, the world felt different. It wasn't that the city had changed, or the office buildings, or the hum of traffic along the streets. It was the way people moved through it, the subtle shift in tone and expectation that comes after something remarkable has occurred. The handshake collapse, as it was already being called, had left a mark not just on the company, but on everyone who had witnessed or heard about it. Ava, in the quiet of her office, watched the news unfold with a steady gaze, aware of the far-reaching consequences yet untouched by the chaos that had gripped so many others. Inside the company, the chairwoman struggled to regain her composure. Staff members whispered nervously in corridors, some in disbelief, some in quiet admiration of the precision with which Ava had acted. The arrogance that had always seemed invincible now looked fragile, almost foolish. Calls that had once gone unanswered were suddenly urgent. Emails that had once been delayed now demanded immediate attention. The chairwoman, confronted by the immediate fallout of her actions, felt the weight of every choice she had made. It was one thing to command a room, but quite another to command respect, and in that moment she saw the difference clearly. Ava's team, meanwhile, was quietly impressed, not just by the results, but by the way she had executed them. There were no grand announcements, no self-congratulatory emails, no dramatic celebrations. The withdrawal of the $2.4 billion had been done with precision, legality, and most importantly, integrity. And as they watched the market react, the news spread, and the chairwoman's reputation faltered, they understood what Ava had always known. Power is most effective when paired with calm, deliberate action and respect. The investors were abuzz, sharing insights and recalculating positions, some quietly relieved that the risk they hadn't fully understood was now contained, others astonished by the speed and clarity of Ava's decision. And across the financial world, commentators dissected the event, trying to understand how such a swift collapse could happen, how one act of arrogance could trigger a chain reaction that unraveled billions. Ava listened to the coverage without reaction, knowing that the story as told by others could never capture the quiet, thoughtful preparation that had led to this moment. She reflected on the irony that had threaded through the entire ordeal. The chairwoman's public slight had been intended as a display of power, yet it had revealed weakness instead. Humiliation, Ava realized, has a way of bouncing back when met not with impulse, but with intention. And the lesson was as simple as it was profound. Respect, patience, and clarity will always outlast arrogance. She felt a quiet satisfaction, not of triumph, but of affirmation, the reassurance that acting with principle is always the stronger path. In the silence of her office, Ava thought about the broader implications, beyond the market numbers and the headlines. She considered the people who would witness the story and perhaps draw lessons from it. Young executives learning about power, business leaders navigating high-stakes negotiations, anyone who might underestimate the importance of respect. And she understood that the ripple effect of her decision would extend far beyond the immediate fallout. The lesson, quietly and effectively, had been delivered. There was also a personal dimension that weighed on her, though she kept it tightly held within. Years of navigating a world that often judged her not by her skill, but by her identity, had prepared her for this moment. She understood the sting of disrespect intimately, the way it can chip away at confidence and cloud judgment if allowed to fester. And she knew, with quiet certainty, that her response, measured, legal, precise, was not only a business decision but a personal statement. That dignity, preparation, and integrity are far more powerful than anger or revenge. Even as the financial repercussions continued to unfold, Ava maintained a steady rhythm in her day. She responded to calls, reviewed reports, and guided her team with the same calm demeanor that had carried her through the previous day. There was no rush, no need to assert herself beyond the necessary. The impact had already been made, and now the work was in observing, understanding, and maintaining perspective. She felt the satisfaction of justice achieved without spectacle, a quiet affirmation that the right action, taken calmly and intentionally, always carries weight. And yet, she allowed herself a subtle reflection on the human element. The chairwoman, once so sure of her authority, now confronted with the real cost of arrogance. She imagined the internal reckoning, the self-questioning that might finally awaken awareness of the consequences that come from dismissing others. Ava understood that not all lessons are learned through punishment. Some are absorbed in the slow realization of miscalculation, in the quiet recognition of what respect truly costs. Across the industry, the story had begun to settle into narrative. Analysts, investors, and journalists alike spoke of precision, accountability, and the audacity of calm action. Ava observed it all, not with pride, but with quiet acknowledgement that what had been set in motion, the ripple of principal meeting opportunity, was exactly as it should be. She knew that the fallout, both professional and personal for those involved, would continue to unfold, and she welcomed it with the serenity of someone who had acted with clarity and purpose. As the day stretched on, and the markets adjusted, the headlines remained vivid reminders of the previous morning's events. Ava allowed herself a brief, private smile, not for triumph, but for the affirmation of a truth she had always known. That patience, strategy, and respect are forces far stronger than arrogance or impulse. And in that understanding, she remained poised, ready to move forward, knowing that while the immediate crisis had passed, the lessons, reflections, and consequences would continue to resonate, shaping both the industry and the people who had witnessed it. In the days that followed, the world seemed to slow down, as if it were taking a collective breath after the sudden shock of the Handshake Collapse. The headlines had spread far and wide, each article recounting the story in its own way, but none capturing the quiet precision behind Ava's actions. She moved through her routine as usual, meetings, calls, reviews, but now everything felt slightly different. The weight of the previous day's events had settled, leaving behind not chaos but clarity. The chairwoman, once unshakable in her confidence, now faced a reckoning of a different kind. There were questions, internal investigations, whispered concerns from colleagues who had suddenly realized that power wielded without respect can crumble overnight. She had always believed that influence and authority could command any room, but Ava's calm, deliberate response had shown her the truth. Respect cannot be demanded, and arrogance carries its own cost. And perhaps, in the quiet moments when she was alone, she would reflect on what had been lost. Not just the money, not just the deal, but the awareness that dignity and decency are far more enduring than a moment of pride. For Ava, the aftermath was measured and purposeful. She didn't seek recognition or applause. There was no grand announcement, no dramatic statements to the press. Her actions had spoken for themselves, echoing through the financial world with a clarity that words could never achieve. Investors and colleagues alike recognized the precision, the integrity, and the unwavering calm with which she had handled the situation. It was proof that true leadership does not come from power alone, but from thoughtfulness, foresight, and the ability to act decisively without losing composure. She allowed herself to reflect quietly on the lessons embedded in the events, both for herself and for those who would witness them. Life, she knew, often presents moments that test character more than skill, that challenge patience more than knowledge. The chairwoman's insult had been a moment of cruelty, a flash of arrogance meant to belittle. But Ava had turned it into an opportunity, not to retaliate with anger, but to demonstrate the enduring power of calm, principle-driven action. In doing so, she had shown that the consequences of arrogance are far more enduring than the fleeting satisfaction of a slight. Ava thought of the young executives, the colleagues, and even the observers in the wider business world who would hear this story and draw their own lessons. She hoped they would see that integrity, respect, and preparation matter more than appearances, that patience is a tool as strong as any contract clause, and that careful observation often yields the most powerful outcomes. Success, she realized, was never just about winning in the moment. It was about creating a legacy built on principle, foresight, and unwavering dignity. In the quiet of her office, she allowed herself a gentle smile, not one of triumph or pride, but one of understanding and satisfaction. The incident had been a test, a moment that demanded discernment and measured action, and she had met it with calm clarity. She thought about the ripple effects, how the lessons of respect, accountability, and thoughtful decision-making would travel through the company, the industry, and the minds of those watching. And in that reflection, she felt a sense of completion, a feeling that justice, quiet yet undeniable, had been served. There was also a human truth that lingered in her thoughts. Ava understood that people often stumble not because they lack skill or intelligence, but because they fail to appreciate the power of empathy, the cost of arrogance, and the enduring importance of treating others with dignity. Her calm response had been more than strategic. It had been a reminder of something fundamental, something timeless. Respect, once lost, is difficult to reclaim, but when maintained, it becomes a force far stronger than money, authority, or status. As the days turned into weeks, the story of the Handshake Collapse became a touchstone, not just for financial analysts or journalists, but for anyone who had ever faced a moment of public challenge, humiliation, or injustice. Ava's actions reminded people that there is power in patience, clarity in preparation, and dignity in responding without haste. She had transformed a moment of insult into a lesson in leadership, a demonstration that calm, deliberate, and ethical action can achieve what anger and spectacle never could. Sitting back in her chair, Ava allowed herself to feel the quiet weight of resolution. The world outside would continue to buzz with commentary, debate, and speculation, but she knew the truth of the moment. The chairwoman's arrogance had created the circumstances, but it was Ava's steady mind and careful strategy that had shaped the outcome. And in that understanding, there was both peace and purpose, a reminder that sometimes the most profound victories are not loud, but quiet, measured, and deliberate. And for anyone listening to this story now, it's a gentle reminder. Moments of disrespect, arrogance, or cruelty are inevitable in life, but how we respond defines the legacy we leave behind. Calm, clarity, and principle are far more powerful than reaction or impulse. And if this story leaves you with even a small sense of perspective, perhaps a deeper appreciation for patience and dignity, then the lesson has been carried forward. If you found yourself moved by Ava's story today, take a moment to like, share, or subscribe. Stories like these remind us that integrity and respect are timeless, and that sometimes the quietest actions leave the loudest echoes.